Great. Hi, everybody. Matt Ellis, founder and CEO of Measurabl. Very pleased to be here with you today, speaking with Jessica Alengakol of DWS, where she holds a senior corporate strategy role, which she's going to be telling you about. Conversation today is around the transition from green to ESG in the real estate asset class. We're going to be talking about where we think we are on a set of key issues, whether they be reporting or certification of assets or data and data quality, and where we think we're going to be going in these next critical quarters and years. So Jessica, maybe we can get going by you telling audience what you do at DWS, and then I'll take a turn and then we'll sort of jump into the content.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Matt. Very happy to be joining this conversation. So Jessica Alengakol, I'm head of global corporate strategy and M&A for DWS, a global asset manager. I actually am recently in this role and had been before this the head of ESG strategy for our alternatives business. So Matt and I go way back, and certainly ESG is one topic that whatever role we have in DWS, I think it's something of a focus for us all. And, you know, I think our company is really continuing to grow on this initiative. I actually lead the ESG strategic initiative for the overall business, as well as along with a couple of other colleagues. So very excited to have this conversation.
Yeah, likewise. I mean, it's been amazing. We've had the chance to work with really almost your predecessor organization, Deutsche Asset Management, before DWS was, I think, spun out. And so to see your team and your organization go from, I think, very much this trajectory of having started by saying, this is important, but maybe we're not entirely sure how. We're going to start to work on data. We're going to start to work on infrastructure to where you're at today with innovation around technology and products that you're offering, even ultimately your end customers, is really remarkable. So I really appreciate your perspective on this stuff. As I said, I'm Matt. I'm with Measurabl. Measurabl is the world's largest ESG data management platform for commercial real estate. So we help our customers who are REITs, asset managers, commercial lenders, investors, LPs, measure, manage, and disclose on ESG. We do that for about $2 trillion worth of real estate across some 75 countries today, headquartered out of San Diego. Jessica, there's a slide we prepared, and you and I over the years have had a discussion on one or more of these points, and they're all fascinating. We only have about 30 minutes to maybe try to add some color to each of them, though. And what they try to describe is these transition moments. Maybe we could just pick up at the top and work our way to the bottom. But one that I think you've got a lot of experience in is this transition maybe from voluntary reporting on ESG to a more compliance-driven environment. Some things that come to mind that are even just timely to this call are the announcement by mighty New Zealand. We shall insist on TCFD-aligned ESG disclosures by our companies. And this is indicative of things going on in Europe around what a sustainable asset even is, how that will be defined, and how it will be marketed by folks like yourselves. And then you look over maybe even in the US and you see more municipal and state level regulation coming up. This is in New York or Cambridge, and on it goes, that compel buildings to measure and disclose on energy and often carbon. So I'm curious your perspective. What's significant about this is this transition real? What's significant about it, and how is it impacting your business?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it's really interesting to see what's happened over the past couple of years. I can kind of crystallize it with some of the things that our CEO Asoko Verman has said in the past. So, you know, somewhere around middle of last year, he said, you know, sustainability is really core to what we do as a business. And then as we shifted through towards the end of the year, it's really become the license to operate. That was sort of the what we were thinking about in 2019. In 2020, what we talk about is ESG is the next normal. You know, you think about how everybody has reacted to this in light of the COVID crisis, the importance of this at the building level. You know, it's not just the regulation piece, but really it's been embedded in everything that we should be thinking about and doing, particularly on the management of buildings. But there were a couple of other milestones to think about, and to your point, it's a lot around what's been happening at the regional and at the government level. So in the EU there was the EU Action Plan that was announced, and a lot of the regulation that came out of the EU Action Plan is starting to come into force over the next couple of years. And so investment managers are having to prepare themselves, having to disclose quite a bit more. That's really the core of this regulation, is around disclosure, and really being able to show to investors, when you say you have an ESG product, when you have a green product, what does that really mean? Demonstrate how that actually works. So at the investment management level, we think this is an important regulatory trend. And then looking at the EU, and as you said, in the US as well, there is the whole movement around climate change, which is also, I think, accelerated in light of the crisis. So, first there was the commitment that many countries in Europe have made to being net zero carbon, and California and New York City and some other places in the US as well. So I think that was something that was happening a lot last year. And this year, in light of the crisis, people are now putting investment dollars to making sure, or government stimulus dollars to make sure this is happening as well. And I think that's also, it's two things. It's the government aspect of it, but it's also, the investment dollars are helping to trigger more activity in this space.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really hear you on that. I mean, I think that this market, at least in the real estate sector, is largely born, this is a certainly debatable statement, by our friends in the Netherlands. And it was the major Dutch pension funds that began to insist on disclosure with an eye towards beginning to allocate those dollars according to green and sustainability themes. That was the start, I think, investors, but the regulators really have come to the forefront. And another way that they're doing it is through stimulus, isn't it? So the crisis of the pandemic came out, and the economic response was to deploy billions and billions of dollars with green strings attached. Europeans, it's roughly 1/3 of the whole stimulus has these types of earmarks. And here in the US, you've got a potential Biden administration that's very clearly stated that there will be a large emphasis on climate change. And because real estate is the world's largest asset class and one of its most environmentally and socially impactful, it's no doubt that those types of government mandates, requirements, and incentives will force some change. They sort of fit in that compliance bucket too. Maybe we can look at the next one down, this plaques to performance concept. We've had here in the States for, well, since the late 80s, maybe early 90s. I'm in San Diego, over on Ridgehaven Court was the first LEED certified building. And Europe is a longstanding pioneer in green building practices, which is BRE. There are dozens of these organizations around the world. And one of the trends that we think might be going on is a migration from a point-in-time certification, or even just a mark of distinction, to something every building will have to worry about and demonstrate ongoing performance around, which are things like carbon, EUI, et cetera. So is this happening in your portfolio? How do you guys use certification? Has it changed? Is it expanding? Things like WELL and other non-operating standards are being integrated into your practice. Can you talk about that?
Sure, yeah. And I think it's still a bit of a mixed bag here. So, I think just thinking about this regulatory piece of it, right? When we saw like the first set of, regulatory standards that came out in green buildings was often sort of tied to the building labels, to having something that was designed to a certain level, a certain LEED standard, for instance, or kind of equivalent standard. But then with the New York City, with those regulations that will be coming into effect in a few years, that was around absolute carbon emissions. And similarly in DC, the standard was around Energy Star. So I think the US seems to be moving more towards that dynamic type of, from a regulatory perspective. And certainly for us, it's very important when we think about our buildings and building performance, that we're looking at, both the level of certification, but also what is the actual, what's the building actually doing? Because, you can have a building that's LEED platinum, but it could be operating on the weekends very inefficiently. So it doesn't give you much sense of the operational aspects of it. In Europe, I think it's an even more complicated story. So you have something called the Energy Performance Certificate, which, depending on what country you're in and also the challenges that it differs by country, it's basically a letter grade of efficiency, but it's something that I think it updates every 10 years. So it doesn't really, again, talk to the level of performance within the building. And I think that's the big challenge, is that you need something standardized like that for market participants to really understand this. Otherwise, you're every time going to do those building audits or whatever you're looking to do to really gauge the actual efficiency and performance of the building. So, I think from where we stand, we certainly want to see things moving towards that. We don't see enough in the market, enough metrics to help us do it. And so that's why just going to the basics of, energy intensity and carbon emissions is really the way to do it. It's just more difficult then to figure out what that means from a relative perspective. How do you benchmark it against peers?
Indeed, and that's just the environmental aspects, and we've now gotten a major boost to the social component of this, where you have a lot of the same problems the environment had, which was how do you measure that, which is really tricky to put a measure and then ultimately some sort of stamp of approval around social outcomes and impacts. Health and well-being being a component even here, you do have certifications that are trying to address that well and fit well, or ones I'm familiar with. I'm sure there's a bevy of them past that, and what the measures are and what the proof of those activities, those benefits are, will become a matter of hot debate. Before we move on, one major point here is scalability of this. One of my biggest concerns, and friends in the industry that I talk about this and sort of nudge them on, is we are still talking about an infinitely small and almost irrelevant a number of buildings that have been certified to any standard whatsoever, something like fewer than 1% of commercial assets out there. And that clearly hasn't scaled in some 20 years. Is it possible that we're paying attention to the wrong proxy, that every building is on the spectrum of green, from not so much to exceedingly, and it is the performance measures of that we all ought to be paying attention to? So just wanted to leave out there, no answer needed, but one thing that I think the folks who are in the certification business will definitely have to pay a lot of attention to. Our third topic that we threw out here is data and data quality. I hear a ton about this in our business. It is so difficult to measure this stuff. And even when you get actual data on real assets, we're not so sure that they're telling us the whole truth, nothing but the truth. These show up in things like GRESB as questions around data coverage. Is this information representative of the whole asset? I wonder if investment grade is possible. What do we need to make it possible so that every building on the planet is able to disclose and investors able to bet against, or lenders able to underwrite against, high quality investment grade data? What do you think has to happen there?
I do think this is a tough one. I think, if you don't have the whole building data, if you don't have a full understanding of how the building operates, it's hard to draw definitive conclusions on a lot of different buildings. And just think we're really talking a lot about office, when we talk about some of these standard metrics. But once you go to industrial, once you go to multifamily and others, it becomes just that much harder. So I think the question to me is whether is it a need to have more people reviewing or quality checking things more? I mean, from perspective of a manager, more costs associated with getting a diminishing amount of returns information on the building, or do we need to just supersize the technological links between our buildings and, you know, and like the systems that we use to track this data? I think that's the part. Like if you have a, you know, we have some these multifamily buildings that are they're garden style, so they could have like 300 meters, you know, so 1 meter for just one little piece of equipment somewhere. And yeah, how do you determine what is the space, like what percentage of space that actually occupies? I mean, it is like going, when you go drill down into that, it would be very hard to quality check that to such a high level. And that's where I think maybe it's not so much the third party assurance as it is a very standard way of looking at this across a bunch of different asset classes where we need to be measuring this. And also, you know, much better tools, I think, to directly port data in versus some of the manual processes, and an efficient, cost efficient way for us as a manager.
Yeah, that, I mean, spot on. This is, you know, in our business, we're trying to build out a platform from meter to market for largely precisely this reason. It is not scalable, cost effective to have third-party assurance on every data point at every asset, let alone once it's wrapped with even more complex data sets like weather normalizations or project CapEx or social engagement programs. So you've clearly got to have some way to scale it up and do it in a satisfactory and rigorous way. Matter of technology, perhaps, matter of cultural change, we'll see. But this is one I think to keep our eye on because it's so important. Investors, I speak with investors, this is the number one complaint. It's not that they don't think there's alpha around ESG, or certainly as at minimum important measures of risk. It's just that they're frozen, not being able to rely on that data that they do have. So until I think we cross this new paradigm, we're going to be stuck a little bit in the mud. I hope we can change it soon. The OpEx, the capital markets, this one, I'll share with you a story that I related to a friend the other day. When I was a broker at CBRE and I sat very close to the project management and property management teams, and I remember first getting acquainted with green building and being all excited. There's just this really new thing going on in the industry. So I was talking on the phone about this, and a fellow named Dave McCurry, who's kind of a famed local San Diego project manager, been around a very long time, he said, you need to stop talking about that because there is nothing new here. We've never tried to build inefficient energy hog buildings. That never made any sense. There's nothing new to say. Dave was right about that point, I think, but he had missed that there was a moment in time where the aperture really opened up. It wasn't just about electrons anymore or energy. It was about environment, broadly writ. It was about social. It was about the policies and procedures we've put in place at the executive level, the fund level, that direct how capital is deployed, all of that put together. And so this one, this sort of OpEx mentality and going towards a more holistic capital markets directed mentality, which is this is going to change whether we even have access to debt and equity, and on what terms. This isn't about an HVAC system anymore, at least not entirely. What's your view on how the industry is perceiving the relative importance between sort of asset level operational matters and CFO boardroom level focus on ESG?
Yeah, I mean, I think I will say that one thing I will say about all of the people that I've talked to that said, oh no, we always make energy efficient buildings. It's like, it's somewhat true, but I do think that when they're designing buildings, oftentimes, you know, it's all about, or even renovations, it's all about making the lobby look nice, that, you know, you want to have those big crystal, you know, chandelier fixtures, things like that. So I think sometimes it's not a deliberate, you're not deliberately looking at that in all of your decision making. And that I think is changing now. It's really becoming much more holistic in terms of design choices that really think about everything, all aspects of ESG in good design, good build. But to your question of what does it mean in the future, you're right. If it's only an OpEx topic, it doesn't, I think, rise to the level of people really can be thinking about the future and what the future holds. And that to me does go to the topic of climate risk, of physical climate risk in particular, when you're thinking about buildings. And then, you know, what is your risk if you're building in a high risk zone and you have a vulnerable asset? You're not thinking about your protections. It's not just, you know, your flood insurance may go up. You may have some costs to fix some flood damage here and there. It's really about, you know, what's this building going to be worth 10 years from now? So I think that is the question that still feels like we haven't a great way as an industry to answer that for ourselves, and it isn't yet kind of, you know, showing up in valuations. What these long-term impacts of climate change would be. But that to me feels one part of the story around capital markets. I mean, the other piece is, I think, the green access piece, and how can you actually get better financing if you are doing something more of a greener building. Still not quite clear that you can, it's a huge additional win to do it from a financing perspective. But certainly I think, you know, between on the residential side, with Fannie and Freddie, for instance, really kind of incentivizing this a bit more, and just the more availability of green bonds, et cetera. I think we're getting there. And that just really opens up the market, you know, maybe makes this more of a part of the transactions going forward.
I think that's, you know, and this bleeds into our fifth and second to last topic to hit on, which is this move sort of from thematic to transactional. I'm just very fascinated to see when this becomes a transactional level issue at the buy, sell, the underwriting, at the insurance side, to your point on physical climate risk. The groups that are very keen to understand that are the insurers of commercial property. We're very worried about, I'm sitting in California, so it's wildfire risk, it's flood and hurricane exposure, things that take a property down to the count for extended periods of time, and the insurance folks are on the hook. So they might look at issues around physical risk, where a commercial lender who wants to competes in the market of a highly competitive market of providing debt funds to assets, and these aren't just banks, these are real estate entities like a Blackstone with massive lending capacity, Prudential Global Investment Management. And will they actually change the terms of the underwriting or flex the interest rate? And will they do that at scale? So I'm curious now, like, I think we have seen the rise and fall of greenwashing and CSR unaligned to any sort of standard reports, because there has to be enough chatter by lenders and investors and operators that doesn't cut the mustard. But have you actually seen the terms on any deals changing out there? And when will we see that?
I don't think it's, you know, it's something as like a binary thing where somebody says, you know, I think we would or wouldn't be able to do something based on, you know, the green risk. Terms changing, it really depends. I mean, you know, certainly people are asking questions about almost like if you have a LEED certification, it speaks to the quality of the building. So it's a given if you're going to finance a trophy office that it's got some type of certification on it. On the other side of things, like, and I'll just use Europe as an example, if you have a building that has a low EPC rating, I mean, you know, in the Netherlands, in some time from now, that's, I think, maybe 2025, you're going to, I mean, you'll face already some level of compliance below a certain letter grade, and over time, it's got to be up to, like, you know, almost an A rating. So I think they're going to see that you'll see that trickling in terms of financeability risk in the future, as and when countries and cities are making more strict regulations. I wonder how that affects the New York market. I mean, it's hard to say now, just given where we are with COVID and the level of likely, you know, emissions and use in buildings today. But thinking about how strict those emission standards were, if I were a lender, I'd want to look at, exactly what that building may be on the hook for in terms of fees, if they are out of compliance with emissions. So I think, yeah, I definitely see this as an important risk management tool in the future. It's probably still in the stage where people are asking questions, want to know buildings are certified, but maybe don't have the right the right tools to ask the right questions, but certainly we'll need to do so in the future, particularly given what you started off with, which is the compliance risk that investment managers are going to face.
Yep. So maybe the compliance comes in, and then the transactional domino falls, right? Because they have to. This is maybe the most fun one for me, and I actually know you spend a lot of time in technology, evaluating through the M&A function of the business what makes sense for you strategically to get involved with. I would love to talk about our last couple of minutes. I think this phenomenon that for a long time in the real estate business, we did focus on the asset, and it was in and of itself this one particular thing, and we would solution there. And that included things like smart building conversations. And it seems to me, I would say this because we work more at the fund portfolio capital markets level in our business, that conversation has substantially matured and evolved to a much more comprehensive fund portfolio level viewpoint. You've got much more senior executives involved in this data and understanding it, and that data is being integrated with other traditional measures of fund performance, lease rates and occupancy and asset values and GAVs and all the financial metrics that we're used to. That only works when you can take what's down here at the asset and bring it all the way across the fund and the portfolio and all the way out to the investors. So I'm curious how you're doing that. Like, how do you build a good technology infrastructure? Does it have to be portfolio wide, or can it be sort of fragmented asset level? Any thoughts on fancy new technologies that you're excited about out there in the world? Open season on that type of big technology question.
Yeah, sure. No, I think the backbone is really having a data system that allows us to collect information on the buildings, and really as much as possible sweeping all of our buildings. I mean, we have hundreds of buildings across the globe. So it's of course somewhat complicated, but making sure we can get all of those buildings in and really have that backbone information. And then I think it does get into especially with some of the higher end buildings, what are the ways in which we can really invest in things to kind of to manage the building better. The interesting thing about this is that a lot of high-end technology has been around the efficiency side of things, which I think didn't really have, from like, if you're thinking about a pro forma for a building, it's probably that operational savings isn't moving the needle a huge amount. And then the other piece of it is once you've done all of those changes, you then are like you've locked in that savings, and then you don't really see much that changes from that. It's a kind of tails off over time, so long as people are operating the building well. So where I think this technology gets very interesting is when you can start to charge more to tenants around it. When you can actually make this truly, a tenant-facing technology. This is something that also, I think, with all of the health and wellness, the greater discussion around health and wellness, I think this is becoming more important. Well, there's, of course, a lot of technologies that are now out there around looking at air quality, looking at ventilation, being able to track it, not just in the building, but from your phone, all of that smart technology that I think has the tenant component to it, to me is very interesting. And I think where the future is going. And then you can really think of the building as more of a service provider, not just the real estate, but really that all-in service provider. What I think is also the linking pin is going to be, how do you create something that is a fully integrated system so that people can bring all sorts of these different technologies into one place to be able to then share it to the tenants. So like the iPhone of buildings, like how does that really happen? So we hear a lot about it. I think it'll be interesting to see how this really progresses, so that you have like basically a fully digital building. And then what are the other pieces, the ways in which you can use the data that you receive from the building. Data privacy issues, of course, keeping those in mind. So I think there's just to summarize, I think there's a lot that still can be done. I think that maybe the real estate industry generally is a little bit later to the game on the technology side. On the, on our active investment management business, we've made a big investment into an artificial intelligence technology. And we see this as something that's going to be a game changer, not only in making our investment platform more efficient, the back office work, but really changing the way we invest. So I think similar things, I would see similar ways in which technology really disrupts in the real estate space as well.
Well, I think that our poor industry has been unfairly, maybe a little bit fairly, called out for being this lumbering dinosaur when it comes to technology. And COVID, among other business model innovations, things like fractionalization of space, are forcing us, whether we like it or not, to step forward. And technology is going to be one of the ways that we do that as an industry. There's no doubt about it. I think the trick will be to see whether we get to the conclusion that we're willing to use technology to innovate and create new monetizations, as opposed to being afraid of it and trying to protect old monetizations. That debate is alive and well. I'm confident us technologists will prevail on that, but we'll need our friends in the real estate operations and management and investment community to also agree. An example is, by the way, real estate organizations hate perfect information. We thrive on asymmetry of information. I know more about a certain neighborhood. I can better value a certain asset. That's how I get my competitive advantage when I transact. And in a world where everybody has a VTS or perfect knowledge about what markets are, what is it that the real estate organizations, in particular service providers, do to value add there? I'm sure they'll be clever and find many new things to offer, but it is a little bit of a startling future out there, isn't it? Thank you so much, Jessica, for chatting with us. I think these all deserve an hour of their own, but I think in 20 or 30 minutes, you gave us a beautiful view into what they are not, and set people up to have conversations of their own. So thanks for joining us, and wish you well out there.